Welcome back to the Retro Vault, where we'll be looking at and diving into stories from games of old. In the last installment we checked out the story from Capcom's Shadow of Rome on PlayStation 2. This time round we'll be going back one generation and checking out the story from Medieval 2. I previously covered the story from Medieval 1, and the link is up there if you want to know the story from that one. However, we will briefly go over the events from that one in this video, so stick around. This game was pretty much identical in terms of gameplay and weapons, but in my opinion was a step up in terms of boss design, but a step down in terms of story. The story also feels like it was set up for a third game, but that third game of course never came. Medieval 2 did however win a BAFTA award for Best Console Game in the year 2000, so that's pretty cool. Finally, before we jump in, please note that there will be spoilers in this video for Medieval 2 and the first game, but with all that being said, let's begin. Alright, so a brief recap to start. In 1286, the kingdom of Gallowmere was overwhelmed by the dead after an evil sorcerer named Zarok hatched a plot to take over Gallowmere using the undead as his army. Legend told that Sir Dan Fortescue led the king's army into battle against Zarok's forces and killed Zarok before he himself succumbed to wounds sustained in the battle, and Sir Dan was declared the hero of Gallowmere. But this was a lie told by the king. Dan was actually killed by the first arrow fired, being pierced through the eye. Very anticlimactic. Zarok wasn't dead either, but he did go into hiding, at least for 100 years, and then 100 years later in 1386, Zarok reappeared and cast a spell across the kingdom of Gallowmere and plunged it into eternal night, and once again he awakened his undead army, and he also stole the souls of the living. This spell extended to Dan, who also awoke from his slumber. After his death in 1286, Dan was not able to ascend to what was called the Hall of Heroes, as he did not die a noble death like the other heroes there, such as his close friend Canny Tim. Dan, eager to earn his place amongst the heroes, vows to defeat Zarok. Dan's travels take him all across the kingdom and he fights various undead enemies, including powerful monsters, and this culminates in a confrontation with Zarok. He defeats Zarok's champion, Lord Cardok, who fought for Zarok in the Battle of Gallowmere, and Dan also defeats Zarok himself. With his lair being destroyed and the spell being lifted, Gallowmere would return to normal. The souls that Zarok stole will return to the living, and Dan returned to his resting place, going back to sleep. If Dan collected all the chalices on his journey, he is able to ascend to the Hall of Heroes and took his place amongst the heroes of Gallowmere. 500 years after Zarok's plan was thwarted, Dan's body has been moved from his crypt and has been put on a display in a museum in London. But on a beautiful sunny day in Victorian London in 1886, things are about to change. A wealthy industrialist and sorcerer named Lord Palethorn has somehow gotten hold of Zarok's old spellbook and casts a spell from it, and just like in Gallowmere, the dead have risen all across London, including the dinosaur exhibits in the museum, and the pages of Zarok's spellbook scatter. As a result, Lord Palethorn's appearance drastically changes, and he now appears to resemble a demon. Again, just as before, the spell has awoken Dan from his slumber, and getting up he speaks with a ghostly figure who introduces himself as Winston Chapelmount. Winston says that Dan should grab a weapon and get ready for the fight, so grabbing a sword from another exhibit, he pushes on through the museum. Fighting through various zombies, dinosaur skeletons, and doing dealings with a dodgy merchant known as the Spiv, Dan has to fight a big dinosaur. Dealing with it as well as its minions, Dan is escorted away by Winston to meet his boss. Inside a lab, Dan meets Professor Hamilton Kift, a self-proclaimed master of the occult. He says that the spell that has affected the city came from Zarok's spellbook. The professor says that he himself has been searching for that book for a long time. However, he does not yet know who is responsible for this disaster. He further explains that the book isn't complete, that pages of it were scattered all over, and that it was only recently that pages started turning up. The professor says that he's imprisoned there at the lab. He says that this lab will be their base for their war against the undead and whoever is responsible. He says that if Dan is able to collect chalices, which contain souls, he will be able to reward Dan with new weapons. He also needs Dan to collect magical energy. Dan is sent into Kensington, as it is the epicenter of the blast that engulfed the city. He is sent there to discover what happened and who is behind it. As expected, the undead roam the streets, and some are being controlled by undead sorcerers. Nonetheless, despite opposition, Dan enters the house from which the spell was cast. Inside, Winston says that something seems to be going on over at the museum, but searching the house, Dan discovers a pocket watch. With the pocket watch in hand, he heads up onto the roof of the museum and spots a couple of shady characters emerging from the skylight.
Huh?
Master will be pleased with booty.
Yes, it's a pity we cannot yet enter the tomb. We will return.
Having entered the museum, Dan finds the tomb that the two characters were talking about earlier on. Entering, Dan fights some mummified undead and finds 3 artifacts: a scroll of Sekhmet, the tablet of Horus, and the staff of Anubis. Inside another chamber, Dan inserts these artifacts into the 3 statues, and something happens in the middle of the chamber. A sarcophagus rises up from the underground, and a mummified woman steps out of it. She collapses and Dan carries her out of the tomb. Returning to the professor's lab, Dan tells him about the shady characters, the snake and the dog and the rocket ship, and then gives him the pocket watch, and the professor says that he'll get to work analysing it. In the meantime, he asks that Dan gather him some more magical energy so he can power his machines. Dan is to go to a carnival, the freak show. It has some weird specimens there apparently. Heading in from the back entrance, Dan finds that the ringmaster is not there at the carnival and that the imps are going crazy. Fighting his way through the bearded ladies and more mages, Dan finds that the imps are attempting to build an army of elephant robots. Tracking 2 elephant robots down, Dan destroys them, obtains 2 keys, and gains access to the tent where these elephant bots are being constructed. Using heavy pieces of metal, Dan destroys the final bot and returns to the professor's lab. The professor has finished analysing the pocket watch Dan found in the house in Kensington. It belongs to Lord Palethorn, and they now know that he is responsible for the spell that has been spread all over London. Kift explains that Lord Palethorn was once part of the Magician's Circle, but that he got expelled after he started to mess around with black magic. The woman that Dan saved is revealed to be called Kia. She was the Egyptian mistress of Ramesses II, and as was custom when a pharaoh died, they would occasionally request that their mistresses would be buried with them, so that they wouldn't be alone in the afterlife. Anyway, she thanks Dan for freeing her and says that she's forever in his debt. Dan heads to the Greenwich Observatory. After Winston did some recon, it seems that more weird stuff is going on over at the observatory at the Naval Academy. And checking it out, on the roof of the observatory, Dan discovers a machine much like a hot air balloon. Winston suggests that if they get the fire going, they could use it, so after finding a set of bellows, Dan stokes the fire and flies the balloon. Meanwhile, the snake, revealed to be called Manda, and the dog, creatively named Dogman, are inside the observatory. Lord Palethorn shows up and asks if it is ready. Manda replies and says that it is, and that at the press of a button, the scope in the observatory will be able to find all the remaining pages of Zarok's spellbook. However, Dan used the balloon to damage the scope, putting a massive dent in Lord Palethorn's plans. Palethorn leaves Manda and Dogman to deal with Dan, and although they are quick and tough, Dan is able to defeat them both. Back at the professor's lab again, Dan speaks with Kift, who congratulates him thwarting Lord Palethorn's plans. He realises that without all the pages of the spellbook in his possession, he will not be able to control the undead. Their new plan is to get the pages before Palethorn can obtain them. Dan is now to head to Kew Gardens. Apparently, Palethorn has gone there and is somewhere within the Kew Gardens. That is, it seems, true, as Lord Palethorn is indeed there, giving Manda and Dogman a dressing down after they failed to deal with Dan back at the observatory. He reveals that although Dan destroyed the grand scope, Palethorn was able to retrieve 1 page of the spellbook. He pulls a lever and unleashes pumpkin men upon the people there at the gardens. Dan needs to hurry up and rescue them using antidotes. Avoiding large pumpkins and heading through the greenhouses, Dan rescues as many innocents as he can, opening up various pathways using numerous valves and plants in order to ascend the greenhouses. Dan gains access to the roof and has to fight an almost unfair amount of pumpkin men whilst avoiding a squishing by giant pumpkins. Unfortunately, Lord Palethorn and his lackeys are gone, so after all the pumpkin men have been dealt with, Dan returns to the lab. The professor is undertaking an experiment, and reading Kift's research journal, Dan finds that for a while now, Professor Kift has been trying to reanimate body parts. This has unfortunately resulted in some rather grotesque monstrosities, which are now roaming around the London Underground. Since the arrival of Kia though, through her knowledge of embalming techniques, Professor Kift has had a breakthrough in his research. But there's another problem. Speaking to him, he states that Palethorn is launching an all-out attack, and that Palethorn has made a giant monster, and that monster could crush them all. Their only hope is to make their own, so Dan must head into the underground and get back some of those body parts for the Professor's monster. The Prof already has the head, but needs 2 legs, 2 arms, a torso, and a bum. Finding all the required body parts, Dan returns to the Professor, and the old coot accidentally drops the head, so Dan lends his head to the monster. Monster Dan, who's now named Dankenstein, is then thrown into a boxing match against Palethorn's monstrosity, the Iron Slugger, with Princess Kia as the prize. With limbs flying everywhere, Dan knocks out the 40-match unbeaten Iron Slugger, much to Lord Palethorn's dismay, and he angrily storms off. Back at the lab, the Professor is delighted, but even though Palethorn is in the mud, their work is not done yet. The Professor has picked up on 2 significant areas of psychic disturbance. One is in Whitechapel, and the other, Professor claims, is like nothing he's ever seen. Aggrieved that Dan can't be in 2 places at once, Kia offers to go to Whitechapel, and despite Dan's protestations that it's too dangerous, Kia sets off eager to help in their fight. So, whilst Kia is in Whitechapel, Dan heads off to Wolfram Hall. Prior to Dan getting to Wolfram Hall, Manda, Dogman and Lord Palethorn are there in Lord Palethorn's fancy machine. They discuss how much of a strange but strong adversary Sir Dan is, expressing surprise that he was able to defeat the Iron Slugger. Palethorn isn't happy, but says that he will now call upon his allies, and he then flies off away from the estate with Manda and Dogman. A little later, Dan arrives. Wolfram Hall is the centre of the psychic disturbance. Professor Kift has detected a great malevolent slumbering evil there. The hall is locked up, so Dan somehow needs to gain access in order to investigate. Using his head, quite literally, Dan attaches it to a zombie hand and gains access via a basement window. With the Dan hand acquiring the key to the front door, Dan enters Wolfram Hall. As well as a load of knights in armour, Dan discovers sleeping vampires inside the house too. Giving them a good frying, he pushes further through Wolfram Hall. He discovers not only the ally that Lord Palethorn was talking about, but also the malevolent slumbering evil that is the source of the psychic disturbance. This is the Count, who says that Dan has disturbed his sleep, describing him as nothing more than a reanimated bag of armour and bones. He congratulates Dan on his journey so far, but states that in his long life, he's thousands of years old by the way, he's defeated hundreds of people much stronger than Dan, and the two fight. Using 4 mirrors which are lying around the area, Dan directs the Count's balls of magic back at him. This breaks the windows in the area, allowing sunlight to flood in. So Dan, using the mirrors again, directs the light towards the Count, and as expected, he is cooked medium rare. After his victory, and now that the psychic disturbance is contained, Dan heads back to the lab. Unfortunately, he is hit by worrying news. The Professor says that he's lost all contact with Kia after she went to Whitechapel. The Professor says that Dan should go to Whitechapel and try to find her. So, heading there, Dan finds the place being patrolled by police. According to the Professor, something powerful has been collecting magical energy there. Dan tracks Kia to an exclusive club, and only after obtaining some flashy threads and a fake beard from a deceased rich man named Isibod Brunel, along with a member's card for the club, Dan gains access. Speaking with the woman there at the club, Madame Jojo, Dan discovers that Kia was there. She told Kia that the Ripper had been killing a lot of her girls, and that Kia went to find him. She tells Dan that he'd better find her before it's too late, and that he should hurry to the clock tower. Getting to the clock tower as fast as he can, Dan is too late, and he witnesses the Ripper kill Kia and suck the magical energy out of her. With her dead, Dan is absolutely devastated. He tries to confront the Ripper, but he escapes, and Dan holds Kia's body as she fades away. Professor Kift mourns her death for a couple of seconds and then cracks on, saying that they still have work to do, and that he's picked up more signals coming from the cathedral. Dan's not having that at all, and he says he quits. The Professor tries to reason with Dan, saying that Palethorn will take control of the whole city if they give up now. Dan doesn't care, and then runs off into the sewers underneath the city. He comes into contact with a race of strange creatures known as Mullocks. After helping them out with a problem involving octomators possessing their animals, they introduce Dan to their chief. Now, weirdly, Mullocks appear to worship Dan. They once found a statue of him. They view him as their god, called the Great One Eye. The chief requests that Dan save their women, as the tribeswomen have been taken by a monster in the sewers. Down there, Dan receives a strange poster from the Spiv featuring a time machine. Tracking the women down throughout the sewers, Dan saves the tribeswomen from the monster's tentacles and returns to the chief. He says that Dan saved him by the powers of something they call the Time Stone. They ask Dan to stay and defend them from future attacks. Dan declines, saying that he must return to the surface. As a reward for helping them, the tribe of Mullocks transport Dan from the sewers to the surface. Back at the lab, Dan has finished having his sulk and speaks with the professor again. He's delighted that Dan is back in the fight and says that they still have time to defeat Lord Palethorn. Dan gives the professor the poster of the time machine. He acts like he's never seen it before, but after Dan confronts him, he confesses and states that he had previously built the time machine, but that the machine does not even work. Dan suspects this was a massive lie. Kif then confesses some more and says that he knew all this was Lord Palethorn's doing all along. That before some expedition in 1878 and Lord Palethorn's expulsion from the Magic Circle, they used to be good friends. Dan heads to the museum in order to see if he can get the time machine working. Back at the museum again, Dan heads to the exhibits, which are all inventions created by Professor Hamilton Kift, and using the Dan hands to help him, he retrieves 3 missing parts for the time machine. Installing them on the machine, Dan activates it and takes himself to the sewers again. Unfortunately, he must break his valuable friendship with the Mullock tribe and must steal their sacred time stone. It's the last piece the time machine needs. They trap him and are now hostile towards him, but he's able to use his trusty Dan hand friends and is able to escape his cage. Dan needs to appear like the chief in order to trick the ferryman into giving him a lift across the water to the time machine, so after knocking out the chief and donning a crafty disguise, Dan leaves the tribe's village via the machine. Leaving the very angry Mullocks behind, Dan then time travels and takes himself back to the moment that Kia was killed by the Ripper in Whitechapel. He prevents her death and fights the Ripper, defeating him. The Ripper begs for mercy, but Dan shows none and shoots him in the face. Kia shows her thanks by necking Sir Dan, and then previous Dan, who of course was there in Whitechapel earlier on, arrives, and present Dan and past Dan merge, and Dan is fortified with some fancy golden super armour, and this also resolves the time travel paradox. Back at the lab again, Professor Kift is glad that Kia is safe and well again. He says that they can get back to going after Lord Palethorn. A signal is coming from the cathedral spires, which of course is where Lord Palethorn is trying to find the final pages of Zarok's spellbook. Dan needs to go to the cathedral spires and find the final pages before Palethorn. Simple. Making his way up the cathedral spire, Dan collects lost souls along the way. These imprisoned souls are how the cathedral is drawing power. But what exactly is drawing that power from inside the cathedral? Entering the spire at the top and after fighting gargoyles that have come to life, Dan must now descend the tower. Fighting more knights in armour, Dan makes his way down and collects 12 of the lost souls. Finding some cogs in order to help him activate some machinery, Dan uses the Dan hands to help him again, and he eventually confronts the bad soul which has been drawing the power from the lost souls. Releasing the lost souls, they attack and defeat the bad soul, and Dan grabs the last of the spellbook pages. However, the cathedral spire begins to crumble and collapse, and Dan must make it out before he's squashed. Thankfully, he makes it out just before the cathedral is completely destroyed. Standing amongst the ruins of the castle, Dan proceeds across the rubble and confronts Lord Palethorn. Palethorn simply takes the book from Dan and says that he should have joined him as they'd have made a great team. With all the pages now in his possession, Palethorn will now be able to control the undead. He offers Dan the chance to join him, saying that he could put flesh on his bones and bring him back to life again. But Dan refuses, saying that he'll never join Lord Palethorn. He offers Manda and Dogman the opportunity to redeem themselves by killing Dan for him, and he leaves the 2 hapless lackeys to do his dirty work. A final showdown takes place between them and Dan, but as expected, Dan takes them both out and proceeds to try and stop Lord Palethorn from carrying out his plan. Dan sees that Lord Palethorn has used the final pages of the spellbook and has summoned a huge blue demon, and Dan must defeat it. Using his nous, Dan does damage to Lord Palethorn's vehicle whilst he's flying overhead, and Palethorn accidentally shoots the demon, causing the demon to damage his vehicle. After a few hits from the demon, this results in not only the demon being defeated, but also that Lord Palethorn's vehicle is out of action. Palethorn, trapped underneath the wreckage, drops a bomb, and Dan has to run away quickly. Okay, so we'll now discuss the endings. As you'll see, I think there may have been a slight coding error in regards to these endings, as they seem to be back to front, but maybe I'm wrong. If Dan didn't manage to obtain all the chalices, which are the souls of the dead, Dan spots that Kia and the Professor have arrived at the ruined cathedral. Kia and Dan embrace one another, and the Professor takes them back to Kia's tomb. Dan and Kia then get inside Kia's sarcophagus and enter an eternal sleep together, at peace. Now this is considered to be the game's bad ending, as not all the chalices were collected, but it seems like a good ending to me. In the other ending, if Dan was able to collect every single chalice in the game, a different ending plays out in which the time machine arrives and Dan and Kia board it. The time machine takes them back to Zarok's lair from the first game, and they are both seemingly killed by Lord Palethorn, who has taken on Zarok's monstrous form. Again, this is deemed the game's good ending, but it seems like a pretty bad ending to me. But that's the story for Medieval 2. However, the story of Dan and Kia is not done yet. There's a third outcome for them too. In the video for Medieval 1, I looked at the backstory of Sir Dan Fortescue, and that included looking at the backstory of Zarok and how Dan was elevated to the captain of the king's army after his father's death. Well, that same comic gives us some information about what happened to Dan and Kia after the game. Truth is that whilst using the time machine, Dan and Kia got separated, and the machine took Dan back to 1286, 600 years prior to the Battle of Gallowmere. Dead Dan has his arm snatched by a dog, and Dead Dan remembers that the dog is his dog, Lupo, and he spots Lupo with Alive Dan, who was out hunting with Lupo. He tosses the arm away, and Dead Dan realises that the man is himself, as he recognises and spots Dan's massive overbite. Anyway, it's at this point that Alive Dan is summoned by King Peregrine, and Dead Dan attempts to sneak into the throne room, and he of course overhears the conversation from outside a window. He overhears that the battle is imminent. Dan falls down and the people freak out, screaming that the undead are there in the city. Dead Dan is helped out by his friend Canny Tim, who bizarrely recognise Dead Dan. Canny Tim introduces Dan to a fairy called Griff. Griff says that the fairies exist to make sure things happen the way they are supposed to happen. They reveal that in about an hour, a Jabberwocky is to attack the castle. They know that Alive Dan will wet the bed, so Dead Dan needs to replace Alive Dan and fight the Jabberwocky. After finding a decent weapon and making sure Alive Dan disappears for the time being, as expected, the Jabberwocky attacks the castle, and Dead Dan, of course, disguised as Alive Dan, defends the castle and the people, and chops off the Jabberwocky's head. Having slayed the beast, the king is impressed, and of course thinks that Alive Dan saved them all. Later that evening, Dan misses Kia, but is attacked by two of Zarok's henchmen, and Zarok orders Dead Dan be taken to be crushed. Dan is then saved by Lupo. Another fairy shows up named Noreen, and she says that Dead Dan needs to take the place of Alive Dan for the Battle of Gallowmere. They say that they'll brew up a body swap potion, and they need a bone from Dead Dan, a toe from Alive Dan, and the heart of someone that loves him. Dan remembers that Kia loved him, but that she's missing somewhere else in time. The good thing is that Noreen can take Dan to her using magic. Dan is taken to Kia's crypt, but he only has 20 minutes. Kia is holding a scroll. It's a note, and it explains what happened to her when she got separated from Dan. It turns out that she went on an adventure of her own. She had travelled back thousands of years to her own time and faced an evil warlock who wanted to summon Anubis into the mortal realm. She writes that another fairy appeared to her and said that there'll come a point where Dan needs help. She writes that she's left him something in a drawer. After writing the scroll, she was then sealed in her sarcophagus and was put to eternal rest. True to what she wrote, Kia had left Dan an item of great power. He returns to Gallowmere and gives them Kia's heart, and Alive Dan is there too, as the fairies had caught him trying to book it and run away. Zarok then turns up and tries to ruin the party and says that he cannot let Dead Dan turn Alive Dan into a hero. Dan then defends his alive self from the undead, and Lupo bites off one of his toes. The potion, since Dead Dan cannot drink it as he has no jaw, is rubbed onto Dan's bones as an ointment. Dead Dan now has his fleshy form back and heads to the troops for battle. He gives a rousing speech knowing exactly what's going to happen to him. And just as fate has it, Dan is felled by the very first arrow in the battle, and the loop goes on. So hundreds of years later, in the present day, historical accounts are quite murky, and some scholars believe that the events of 1886 and what happened with Dan's second resurrection and Lord Palethorn never actually happened. Some scholars even believe that disease spreading through London caused people to hallucinate. But one day, Professor Darrow, who was located in Cambridge and had been studying the life and adventures of Sir Dan Fortescue for a long time, was visited by a strange man. He recounts Dan's tales and how no one was able to find Professor Kiff's time machine because it was lost as a result of time traveling, that it's somewhere in a different timeline. After this, the strange man is revealed to be Dan himself, and his missing eye has been replaced by the Eye of Amun-Ra, the item of great power that was given to him by Kier. He gave the eye to the other Dan, and that is who is standing before Professor Darrow. And that's it for the story of Medieval as a whole. I enjoyed diving into this franchise, and I'm sorry that this video took so long to produce. It sat on the back burner for quite a long time, but I'm glad that I was able to get it over the line. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. Comment your thoughts down below, but for now, take care, and I will see you in the next one.